It is a great honor to be joined by Nicholas Eberstadt. He is the Henry Wendt Chair in Political Economy at the American Enterprise Institute. His most recent book is a reissue of his previous book, Men Without Work, updated for the pandemic. How are you today, Nick? Thank you for joining the show.
Thank you for inviting me.
Okay, I should like to begin by asking you about the place where you work at, the American Enterprise Institute. What is it? What is its mission statement?
It's a think tank. I think these are officially called Public Policy Research Institute. It's more of an American organization, I think, an American type of organization than something one finds in other countries. It's not connected to a particular interest or to a particular political party. People fund it despite that. This is, gets back to kind of the Tocquevillian thing in the USA. Our mission is the competition of ideas in the world. Our founders believed that competition of ideas makes for a stronger society. And our particular perspective is on opportunity, limited government, strong defense. We have a range of people within our organization who disagree with each other, which is part of what makes for this competition of ideas. And I think I've been there for a long time, I think if there's anything that, maybe everybody would agree on, they're probably in favor of free trade. But on any other public issue, you can probably find a pretty respectful disagreement between at least two of the researchers.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I've become quite familiar with the Institute's works as well as some of the personnel. I've actually had Matt Continetti on this show
Sure.
last year, and he says that it's the avant-garde, so to speak, of conservative thought. So it's
well, Matt Continetti is one of our great young talents, and so it's a great catch for our organization, I think.
Mm-hmm. So tell me about your work in political economy in general.
Well, political economy is a pretty big hunting license because it allows one to look at any place where either policy or collective action or other sorts of polity effects bear upon economic performance or economic outlook. So my PhD dissertation was on the economic race between North and South Korea during the Cold War era. I picked a pretty unresearchable topic, an almost impossible topic to research given the limitations of information in North Korea at the time. But I'm kind of a stubborn guy. And that, as you can, that's kind of like a total political economy question, because we're looking at economic development under two completely substantively different regimes with the same people, like a natural experiment in international development and politics. Excuse me, something going on here. And more recently, I've worked on Russia, on China, on questions in the United States. I mean, this is a toolkit that I can kind of go all around the world on. Most recently, as I think you mentioned, I've done a book on Men Without Work, America's Invisible Crisis. There's a post-pandemic update on this, looking at the collapse of work for men in the United States. But other sorts of things that I've done include looking at family structure in China, how that is changing, how that looks to change in the future, and the bearing that that'll have on society, economy, maybe even politics. I've got a study I'm doing now on Russian power in decline, which is looking at the demographic base of the Russian power, and I'm doing some work on the outlook and the outlook for demographic trends in the world and how this may affect the global economy in the generation ahead. I mean, that's just some of the things that I work on.
I see. I look forward to the publication of the Russia study. I would like to focus this conversation on what's going on in the Korean Peninsula, particularly North and South. But I'd like to spend a few minutes discussing your book, Man Without Work. First question, is it a play on the title of that band, Man at Work?
Well, I've been asked that, believe it or not. I've also been asked if it's a play on the novel Men Without Women. It just seemed like a pretty simple title. I like to have simple titles sometimes. Back during the Cold War era, I did a book called The Poverty of Communism, which I guess has a little bit of a play in it also. I had a book called Nation of Takers about the increasing disposition towards means-tested benefits in the United States. So I think that simple titles tend to be easier on readers than long, complex disquisition on the declining labor force participation in the United States and its possible implications for society, economy, and politics.
I see. So what has changed since the first edition of the Man Without Work book versus the COVID edition?
I'm glad you asked that. Of course, it's the COVID catastrophe that befell the United States. Over 1 million Americans have died so far as a consequence of COVID. The reverberations for the workforce did not come from the high death toll. The high death toll was mainly for people who were beyond working age, for much older Americans. What we've seen in the U.S. since the COVID catastrophe is something very new. We now have a peacetime labor shortage. We have 10 or 11 million job openings that just don't seem to get filled. And we also have a drop-off in workers, about a shortfall of about 4 million compared with pre-COVID trends. And we have to explain what's happened here. Part of this is an interruption of immigration in the United States in 2020 and 2021, but that probably can't explain more than about a quarter of this shortfall. Part of it is people who are suffering from long COVID or taking care of people who are suffering from long COVID, but that's a few 100,000 people say that is why they are out of the workforce. So that's a large number, but it's not a big number compared to 4 million. Most of this seems to be what I would call a new face to the flight from work in the United States. It's men and women over the age of 55 who I would say have prematurely retired from the workforce. And I think there's good evidence that one of the reasons they may have done this is because of COVID policies, because of the overshoot of benefits for people during the pandemic emergency. I mean, the government wanted to avoid a second Great Depression. It didn't want the lockdowns to end with a crash of the world economy. So they put money in people's pockets, so much money that savings rates actually doubled during the years 2020 and 2021. Personal savings rates doubled. It's the only economic crisis I'm aware of where personal disposable income actually rose. And of course, this was because of government help. I think that this is probably one of the main reasons that we've seen this peculiar drop-off in manpower availability and this peculiar increase in unfilled jobs. And I presume this will eventually work itself out, but it may take some time.
Mm-hmm. I think if you study enough Keynesian economic theory, you will, I guess, likely approve of what the government is doing in that it creates stimulus packages in order to, I guess, stimulate demand, so to speak, and both for work and for consumption. So I wonder if in this scenario, if it has been applied correctly.
Well, it's a very good question. In how to say, you and I both remember the sort of fog of war that we were all in the early months of the pandemic. People didn't quite understand what this coronavirus was. They didn't know how contagious it was. They didn't know how deadly it was. They didn't know what the effects would be on locking down societies, or what the outlook would be for the world economy. And so policymakers were operating with this fog of war also. And they, in retrospect, clearly overshot. They clearly overcame. I don't think that they let's see, in retrospect, I suppose, I can't speak for the policymakers in Washington, but I would guess that if you talk to most of them even today, you'd find that they would say, we're okay with dealing with the unintended consequences of this huge intervention if the alternative was not acting and risking a terrible economic panic and collapse. But I can't speak for them. I have a sense that it's something like that.
I see. Yeah. So I guess their logic would be it's either massive inflation or massive unemployment. You pick your poison, so to speak.
Well, there is this Keynesian mental tick. I think you rightly identified in much of the work on unemployment and labor economics, and I think the Keynesian distraction has contributed to a misdiagnosis of the men without work problem, because there has been a ceaseless, continuing exit from the workforce by prime age men in the United States. Prime age being 25 to 54. I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory. This has been going on since the mid-1960s. And the received wisdom in economic and policy circles is that this is largely due to inadequate demand for less skilled workers. Now, there is some truth to that. We do have a big economic and technological transformation, a structural transformation of the economy. But if that story were accurate, you'd see the men who were you would see the proportion of men with no paid work, kind of circulating like that along with the business cycle. On the cover of the first edition of my book, I show what the percentage of men not in the labor force for this group looked like over a 50-year period. It's almost a straight line up. There's no business cycles there. So the Keynesian nostrums can't explain the most fundamental trend that we've had to deal with.
Mm-hmm. So to segue into our topic of the hour, how would you compare the pandemic response of the United States government versus that of, say, South Korea?
The United States government had a very expensive and haphazard response to the pandemic. The only truly successful aspect of the U.S. response was the scientific and pharmaceutical innovations that brought about the messenger RNA vaccines, which were a fantastic breakthrough in absolutely record speed at a time when many people who were specialists in the area weren't even sure if it was possible to come up with a vaccine for a coronavirus. That part, I think, was very successful. I mean, but the rest of it, I mean, you can look at the death rates in the United States, and you can see, you can judge by the results there. You also know that we lost a tremendous amount of schooling for our children. Economists are estimating that the net loss of wealth to the United States, not just now, but in the coming decades, is absolutely extraordinary because of the COVID school lockdown policies. In South Korea, there was a very strict COVID policy, and I think it was much more successful in preventing loss of life. There will probably be some lasting psychological damage from this, and it certainly is true that one sees this somewhat ominous downward spiral in the birth rates in South Korea, which has taken place in conjunction with the pandemic. Can't say it was caused by the pandemic, but it makes one wonder. South Korea's fertility level was already extremely low, but now, as of course you're well aware, it's plunged into terra incognita. We've never seen an affluent society in peacetime with a fertility level of well below half of what it would require for what would be required for long-term population stability.
I believe it was 0.78, right? From the last data that I've read.
Yes, yeah, and so it's almost, I mean, it's over 60% below 60% below what would be needed for long-term population stability. Mm-hmm. And it's unimaginable to me, unimaginably low in Seoul. It's, I believe, 0.6966. I mean, it's basically a third of what's required for population stability.
Yeah. So I wonder if I think Francis Fukuyama in the 90s, he wrote another study called Trust, and which he assessed the population's distrust in their nation's government, and he believes that during a crisis, if the trust in the government is low, then it may not be handled as well. And I think it applies to the COVID era too, in that The nations that have the most effective COVID response are several East Asian countries with a market economy. You have your Taiwan and your South Korea, but most, if not all, Western countries have bungled it, have bungled their response. And that, I believe, has to do with the fact that the Western societies, especially America's, has been a lot more divisive. And it just so happens that COVID struck at this time.
It's it's a troublesome thing in the US to see the trends in trust for not just government and political institutions, but for civil institutions, for education, for justice and law enforcement, for business, all across the board. Trust has been on the decline for the last 30 years. This is just a topic maybe for a different discussion, but something very curious has happened to the United States in the post-Cold War era. I mean, at this period when the United States had unparalleled wealth and unparalleled global influence, global reach, global power, we've also seen this decline in trust in the US. We've seen the rise of something that I have in other studies I've described as the new misery. The deaths of despair is only one indication of a whole panoply of factors that I think could be called the new misery. So why this is happening, I don't think that I can explain to you, but it is quite clear that something has been going on and that the USA is in a bad patch right now.
But there is, if I were to follow my logic in that, well, trust in the government helps alleviate the worst aspects of a crisis, then South Korea, as an example, would be kind of an anomaly because it has both handled the pandemic quite effectively, but at the same time, its government, or at least the people's trust in its government, has been quite low. And that from the latest news that I've read, it has gone through a period of rampant corruption, and the last or the second to last president was impeached, and now the current president is this very divisive, conservative sounding fellow. So can you tell us more about what's
Sure.
going on with him?
Well, South Korean politics has been polarized since the beginning. Whether because or despite the government's actions, South Korea has developed in an extraordinary manner over the last several generations, from deep poverty to tremendous affluence. But over one of the continuities has been a deep polarization in South Korean politics and a distrust of political actors. So this goes back to the partition of the Korean Peninsula at the end of World War II. There are really two civil wars going on within the peninsula. One is the civil war, the unfinished civil war between the North, the government in the North, and the government in the South. And that, I think, can be seen as a civil war. There's also a civil war of sorts within the ROK in the South, between what in my day we would have called leftist and rightist forces, what might be called conservatives and progressives today. It's talking about the same groups. And and again, this traces back to the early liberation period, and South Korea has. I mean, South Korea has really only had 35, 36 years of constitutional democracy that you and I would call constitutional democracy. It was under military dictatorship before that, and it was under a sort of a questionable non-military rule, at the start. But you can go through and see what's happened with the different presidents. Almost all of the presidents, whether they are progressive or conservative, so-called, have ended up in disgrace. One progressive president committed suicide over a financial scandal. The two most recent former conservative presidents ended up in jail. You go back and the Nobel Prize winning progressive president earlier on was the subject of a tremendous financial scandal, a big bribe to the North Korean side. You go through it, and there seems to be a kind of a continuing thread of corruption and antagonism and instability there. And yet, South Korea's society and economy have performed in an absolutely extraordinary way over the past 60 years.
Mm-hmm. But moving on to the North, aside from information provided by North Korean dissidents, how can we know, the exact numbers and figures of, say, the North Korean population, demographic, political situation, GDP, all that such?
It's not very easy, is it? I can tell you what I have done on this, because I found the data famine to be most vexing in trying to understand performance, socioeconomic performance in the DPRK in North Korea. The North Korean government has, imposed this statistical blackout on the country because it's got a totalist view, and it does not wish for any outsiders to be able to draw their own conclusions independently about the strengths or weaknesses or performance or strategy or vulnerabilities of their polity, of their society. Back in the 1980s, while I was a graduate student working on Korean questions, colleagues of mine, by serendipity, were given some data from North Korean statistical officials concerning the population situation in the North. These numbers had been given by the DPRK government to the United Nations as a sort of a down payment for technical assistance with a population census that they were planning. It was the 1980s. North Korea had been an independent country for 40 years. They'd never had a population count, population census. They wanted some help with that. With a friend of mine, a colleague at the U.S. Census Bureau, Dr. Judith Bannister, who was the head of the China branch of the U.S. Census Bureau, we used these meager data. They were a treasure trove for North Korea, but for any other country, they wouldn't have been much to look at. We used them to reconstruct the population trends of North Korea from the 1953 ceasefire until the late 1980s, when the series ended. And I think we did a pretty, a pretty comprehensive job, given what we had, in reconstructing total numbers of people, the male, female, the education. We even were able to kind of get a hint at the size of the North Korean army. The government was not so happy about that with me later on. So by the end of the Cold War, I think we had a pretty good idea of what North Korea's population looked like. We also had a pretty good idea of its international trade situation because of what we call mirror statistics, the trade reported by trade partners. They report North Korean exports as their imports. They report their imports as exports, and we could piece those together. So I'd say that 30 years ago, we had a pretty good sense of certain aspects of North Korea's population, society, and economy. And the trade was although North Korea's trade was limited, of course, it was like a little aperture, a little peephole into the performance of the national economy. Mm-hmm. Since then, the situation's become much more uncertain to a statistically minded person such as myself. Even though the North Korean government has released the results of two national population counts, one that they call the 1993 count, even though it was taken in 94, another that was taken in 2008. The problem with those two census returns is that they seem to be filled with inconsistencies, curious inconsistencies. And I can't know for sure, of course, because I'm an outsider, but the simplest and easiest explanations, the sort of, if you will, the Occam's razor explanations for these inconsistencies would be that the North Korean government falsified the first population census to hide the size of its military, and falsified the second census to hide the size of the famine, the terrible famine that occurred after the end of the Cold War in the 1990s in North Korea. Population statistics, I think, are adrift and not terribly reliable nowadays, in my view. And when it comes to trade statistics, the North Korean nuclear drama and other changes in recent years in North Korea has meant that there's been an end to almost all commercial non-military trade with countries other than the People's Republic of China. And the Chinese government has reasons not to report faithfully and accurately what its commerce looks like with the DPRK, because it may be violating some of the sanctions that China itself has voted for in the UN Security Council. So we have this strange situation now where we probably know even less about the North Korean economic and social performance today than we did 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I wonder, from what we can reliably know, what is the political ideology that guides the government of North Korea? Is it Marxist-Leninist, or is it like a Kim family cult of personality, one or the other more?
Well, that's an excellent question, and that's something that we can be pretty confident about, because we can read what the government produces. We can read what they say, and that is the ideology. The North Korean state was originally established as a Soviet satellite. I mean, Kim Il-sung came into Pyongyang wearing a Red Army outfit with the Soviet Red Army, because the original agreement was at the end of World War II that the U.S. would process the Japanese imperial surrender in the southern portion of the peninsula, and the USSR would process it in the northern portion. So in with the Red Army came a prototype Soviet satellite state. All of the appurtenances, a secret police, a political prison system, the beginnings of a centralized economy, everything. And for the first, almost for the first decade of the partition, Marxism, Leninism was the ideology until the death of Stalin. Stalin was revered in schools, in doctrine, in pronouncements. But it was quite clear that that the founder of the North Korean dynasty, Kim Il-sung, had other ideas for the future. And starting as early as 1950, 1955, 1956, Marx and Lenin and Engels all started to be downplayed. And today, you won't find any Marx, you won't find any Lenin in North Korean political pronouncements. What's happened gradually over time was that a new ideology was put into place. Some call it Juche thinking. Juche is one of the official terms. It's a little bit difficult to translate, but it means kind of taking charge, on our own. Probably the most important document in this new way of thinking is something that's not discussed too much in the outside world, but is called more or less the 10 principles for the establishment of a monolithic ideology. And the 10 principles really lay out a sort of a idea that there is a socialist racialist state for Korea. The background litany is that the Korean people have been victimized by big countries all around them, Japan, China, sometimes Russia, the United States, and that the Korean people need an independent socialist state to protect them, to gather them together, and to stand up to these international villains. So, in a different world, I mean, you're in Vienna. In a different world, I would describe that as National Socialism, but that term has a resonance of its own. That term has already been taken over in Vienna and Germany and Central Europe. So we'd call it racial socialism, and the 10 principles indicate that it is the Kim family that act more or less as the prophets for bringing together the Korean people and for bringing them to an independent socialist state in which they will be able to reach this Elysium where they will no longer be beholden to the nations or races that have abused them throughout history. So it is a radical departure from Karl Marx, let us say that.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So within that ideological framework, how do the Ministry of Information Propaganda of North Korea depict, say, one, Americans, and two, their fellow Koreans in the South?
Excellent questions. Well, of course, the United States is regarded as a principal international enemy. That's not too much of a stretch, since one can remember that in the Korean War, the U.S. came to the defense of South Korea after the surprise attack from the North and thwarted the unification, what otherwise would have been a very rapid unification of the Korean Peninsula under Kim Il-sung's jurisdiction and rule. People in North Korea remember something that people in the outside world don't always remember, which is, as part of the terrible fighting in the peninsula, the United States-led forces executed a devastating and prolonged bombing campaign on the North, which killed a lot of people. At one point, and you can imagine how chilling this is, at one point, the head of the Strategic Air Command during the Korean War, General Curtis LeMay, reported that the raids on Pyongyang were being called off because there were no more targets left. Think what that means. So the grievances and the memories of bad times with the United States are, I think, easy to kindle. The United States remains, in the North Korean view, the principal impediment to reunification of the peninsula on North Korea's terms, unconditional reunification. So the U.S. is enemy number one. Enemy number two would have been, may still be, Japan, because of its imperial colonization of the peninsula. There's also a certain amount of animus towards the PRC and towards China, even though China is the North Korea's main economic backer at the moment and acts often as its sort of defense lawyer at the United Nations and elsewhere. But there's a considerable memory of bad experience with pre-communist China, with imperial China, and with the sort of the vassal arrangements that imperial China had in the tributary system with places including Korea. So there's plenty of ill will to go around, but the U.S. is kind of the main villain, I think, at the moment. The attitude towards the South, in some sense, is inseparable from the attitude towards the United States. The United States is regarded as the key imperialist power, and South Korea, as a corollary, is an imperialized colony under U.S. sway, with lackeys and bootlicking servants to the imperialists. There is no thought that there could be an independent constitutional democracy genuinely supported by the South Korean population. In the North, in fact, there is only one legation from the South that has any offices in Pyongyang, and that is something called the AINDF, the Anti-Imperialist National Defense Front. And that's a imaginary group which supposedly represents freedom fighters in the South who want to overthrow the overthrow the colonial rule and bring democracy to the South. Democracy in this case meaning an extension of Kim Jong-un's dictatorship, unconditional dictatorship to the South. So in the North Korean telling, there is absolutely nothing that is redeemable about the current political arrangement in the South. Even the most progressive or left-wing political actors are seen as being vassals of the U.S. government. It brings to mind a question, of course. In the North, very much unlike what Marx and Engels would have eventually imagined in a communist society, the North Korean state has imposed an intricate class system called Songbun, with over 50 different designated classes, depending upon your background. Were you a revolutionary hero? I mean, did your ancestors fight with Kim Il-sung? Were your ancestors collaborator bastards with the Japanese? Were they Christians? Were they landowners? So forth and so on. About a third of the population is in what is called the complex or the hostile classes at the bottom, and they don't have a very good time. I think we can be pretty sure that most of the people who died in the terrible famine in the 1990s were from the hostile classes. It begs the question of what the class background would be for the 50 plus million people in the South if they were absorbed into the North Korean state the way that North Korean doctrine would like to see.
Mm-hmm. So I like to focus on the peace process, or the semblance of a peace process between the North and the South. And of course, the Korean War, the Korean Civil War never really ended in 1953, and the armistice only marked the end of U.S.-Soviet intervention. And it's only an armistice and not a peace agreement. Ever since then, I can think of only two episodes where there's actual mutual dialogue between the North and the South, and one of them happens in, I believe, 2003, and it awarded the South Korean president, I believe it's Kim Dae-jung, a Nobel Peace Prize. And secondly, it's during the presidential administration of Donald Trump, and then you see pictures of him with the current leader, was it Kim Jong-un? And
Kim Jong-un, yeah.
And it has been like the subject of many internet memes and such. But
yep.
I'm very much not sure what has become of that particular dialogue, and whether or not any future dialogues is going to occur.
Very interesting questions, very important questions. There was an earlier episode, which would make it 3 in all. The first episode of dialogue occurred in the 1970s, in 1972, between the military ruler Park Chung-hee and the then ruler of the North, the founder Kim Il-sung. The second one, as you indicated, was between Kim Dae-jung and the son of the founder, Kim Jong-il, in the year 2000 in Pyongyang. And then, of course, there's the more recent one with the grandson and President Trump, several international meetings. Each of these occurred for reasons of state that, on the basis of calculations in the North. The thing to recognize over this broad period of time is that it is the North Korean state that entirely controls the pirouettes and dances of the peace process. The North Korean state has always been the one that decides when the dialogue will begin, who will be included in the dialogue, what the terms and agenda of the dialogue will be, and when the dialogue concludes, which is often very abrupt and unpleasant. In the North Korean state's calculus, the dialogue is only one half of an approach to international affairs, with the other half being aggressive, threatening, menace on the other, follow-up. In the early 70s, the North Korean government thought that there was a change in the world configuration that might be menacing to it, with the Nixon to China moment, and with the shift of Chinese alignment towards the U.S. and away from its Maoist previous policy. And the North Korean government also thought there might be a chance that the U.S. would be abandoning South Korea as the Vietnam War wound down, and as it became clear that the United States was failing in its objectives there. So that was a period of probing. It was trying to probe to see what benefits or opportunities were available in the South. There weren't many. So the mission was terminated, and the dialogue ceased. In the year 2000, the North Korean state was in dire straits. This was at the end of the famine and the economic collapse in the post-Soviet era. It desperately needed cash, and the South Korean government bought a summit for maybe $500 million, maybe $1.5 billion. The figures differ. I don't think there's ever been full clarity on this. That money, ironically, helped to fund the North Korean military and the North Korean nuclear program, which is dedicated to threatening the South. Out of that came a document, the Pyongyang declaration, the joint declaration of the year 2000, which contained very important language for North Korea. The language being that the North and the South would decide for themselves. They would work towards an independent peace. That was North Korean code language for decades for getting the United States out of the Korean Peninsula, ending the U.S. alliance with the South, and getting U.S. troops out of the South. Wittingly or not, the South Korean side signed that language. After it was signed, the North Korean side had no more use for them, so there wasn't the dialogue ceased. With the Donald Trump, Kim Jong-un interactions, there were two things were involved from the North Korean side, I think, my interpretation. One was trying to avoid a confrontation with the United States that would lead to the destruction of the North Korean state, either through military confrontation or through economic strangulation, because the sanctions were having quite a bite at that point. And the second was the was the possibility that Trump really was as different from all previous American presidents as people in the outside world seemed to be saying, and maybe it would be possible to get the man that Kim Jong-un in public had called the dotard, the old fool, to make an agreement that was beneficial to North Korea. That didn't work out, and the dialogue once again came to a close. But I think we can be confident that if the interests of state in North Korea suggest that it will be time to have a charm offensive or a peace offensive again, that the warming and the opening will occur.
So, final question. I'm reminded of this quotation from Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai when he was asked what is the implication of the French Revolution, and he said, well, it's too early to tell. So it has been 70 years since the armistice, and so what can we conclude about the outcome of the Korean War?
Well, the Korean War, in the words of historian William Stuke, was the alternative to World War III. There were Chinese forces fighting U.S. forces with Soviet assistance in the Korean Peninsula. The world did come up to the nuclear brink and avoided it, as it has since. The Korean War made possible the success that we've seen in the South. It didn't guarantee the success. It simply allowed for the survival of the South Korean state, which developed remarkably and moved towards the imperfect democracy that we know today. All democracies are imperfect. I don't think that anybody at the time of the ceasefire would have imagined how spectacularly successful and how prosperous the South Korean economy has become over the past 70 years. And I don't know that anybody would have guessed that there would be such a terrible chasm between the two Koreas, that poverty would be so abysmal in the North. Because at the time of the separation, the North was the portion of the peninsula that was the more affluent. I don't see how this partition can continue indefinitely. I actually would have imagined it would have ended already. Obviously, it has not. There are reasons that it continues. But I believe there will be a future in which the Korean peninsula will reintegrate and will heal, given the historical problems and the enormous differences today. I think we can expect that would be a historical process that would take quite a bit of time.
Mm-hmm. Well, on that note, thank you very much, Nicholas Eberstadt of the American Enterprise Institute for joining the show.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Awesome. Yeah, I enjoyed this conversation a lot. And
so did I. Well, great questions.